it's Peter Merrick, and we're going to have a really interesting conversation. We're going to be speaking with Sean Stone. Sean worked on conspiracy theories with Jesse Ventura and had his own program for several years called Buzzsaw. And he asked the questions that most people are frightened to ask. And this is why it's really important. I do these podcasts for one reason. I'm hoping that people start thinking. You have a front cortex and you have to use it. And in these days, most people are asleep and they've actually failed to ask questions, and they end with a conclusion when they begin with the same conclusion, and they do not question. Sean, thank you so much for spending this time with me.
It's great. You know, I know we have a lot of similar interests, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I'm very interested. A few years ago, I'm sitting in Toronto, I'm working late at night, and I keep on getting these little ads to go and join this new online network called Gaia. And I joined it, and there were two programs I watched. I watched the one with Brandon Briggs, because I read so many of his books. And I watched yours, and I also remember when you were working with Jesse Ventura, and I found it very interesting, and I just want to share something with you. When I was watching your programs, and also with Jesse Ventura, I didn't go and look at it like really question, and there's no reason for me to question what you were saying and what you were exploring. And the reason was, and I've come down to like several reasons. One, I trusted everyone who ever taught me anything. There was no reason for me to question. They were authority. And you know, if someone says I've been doing something for 30 years, I didn't even question if they were doing it right for 30 years. Number two, I was just too busy. I wanted to go and sign up to like consumerism. I wasn't a religious person. I was a materialist, and my religion was materialism. And everyone I hung out with, it didn't matter if they were black, white, Chinese, Buddhist, Hindu, we were all materialists. So I never asked those questions. I didn't have the ability to even frame the question. And lastly, and the most important thing, I'd be frightened to ask the questions, because God forbid I would be ostracized. Because what's happened in the last 3 years, Sean, is there's been such a break amongst family, friends, colleagues, and I hope you can shed some light, because you've been walking this path longer than most of us.
I've been walking it since I was, you could say I was never not walking it, because I was, talking about privilege. I had the privilege of being born into a home where my father was, really, how do you say, really starting to peak in terms of his success. And, he was able to tell stories as a filmmaker that were, exposing things, the dark side of like American foreign policy. I mean, one of his first successful films was Salvador, which was about, the 1980s, the U.S. policy of supporting the regime down there that was using death squads, essentially, against what they considered, socialists, but a lot of times were just, poor peasants trying to, that were trying to organize and just you name it. It was very brutal what happened. There were the murders down in Salvador. Even the archbishop there was assassinated. I mean, it was a very ugly time. And so my dad's first successful film as a director was that, and then Platoon thereafter, which was like the dark side of the Vietnam War, and Born on the 4th of July. Even the dark side of the basically that whole era of the protests against the war, and how and how people were treated. Vets like Ron Kobe were treated for basically saying, I can't be for this war because I see how ridiculous and ugly this is. And, we're ultimately, we're slaughtering innocents, and we're destroying a landscape there that is not ours to fight for, as Kennedy had talked about. That led to JFK, right? My dad's film about Kennedy assassination being conspiracy. And so, I mean, I'm watching this, behind the scenes, right? I'm seeing a lot of the, getting insights, getting conversations, getting access to, thoughts that don't necessarily end up in the final film. And it helped, shape my perspective on politics and conspiracy. And it's like, if you grow up understanding that, politics is power politics, right? And that there's forces that are, economic forces and financial political forces that are, financial forces and corporate forces that are behind the scenes, right, influencing politics, then you're not going to be so swayed when the guy goes on the screen with his, with his speech like an actor, right? That's what he is. He's the president of a corporation. It's like, now the agenda is today, we're going to go fight this. That's what they do. The presidents just set the next war. The next war is on poverty. The next war is on drugs. The next war is on Iraq. The next war is on the economy. I mean, it's like, that's how they do it, right? They just go war to war.
I heard the best example of what politicians are. You come in from, let's say, Africa, and there's a beautiful building, and there's the doorman, and you've never really seen a beautiful building like this. So you think the doorman actually owns the building, but they don't. And that's who the politicians are. And the person, right, the people, or whatever it is, because right now, all bets are off. I never believed in evil before, like absolutely like evil, and I was not a spiritual person. However, this is literally the stuff that's happening. It's just, this is like, your father couldn't do a movie like this. Like, well, this movie right now is
yeah, well,
scary.
That's the thing, is that I think that in many ways, he doesn't even fully grasp the nature of what we're looking at with the medical industrial complex and the World Economic Forum and factors like this of greater forces than he kind of leaves off at military industrial complex. But
right,
military industrial complex and medical industrial complex are very much married, as we know, because of the nature of biochemical warfare, and how once Nixon and others basically signed agreements saying we won't do more offensive biochemical warfare, what they started to do was they would do these tests with, like, well, we're designing vaccines, against potential threats. So that's why we can do.
Can you refer to that as we're doing experimental juices? Do something like that, because I'm going to post this on.
Sure. So
I'm just very aware of that.
Yeah. So historically, they were saying, like, you could basically we can design experimental jabs, or can I say that?
Jabs or jabadoos or something. It's like whatever you want. Like, just something that's going to, like, not.
Well, I'm trying to give the history, because it's not about anything.
Please. Okay,
go. The past.
Okay,
so like, so the idea was, in the past, it's like they were doing the justification for biochemical warfare, right? Was, how do you say, it was always defensive. So they were saying, like, we're developing a vaccine against anthrax. We're developing shots against, you name it, Ebola, whatever, AIDS, right? And that's how they could then get away with researching and playing with essentially what are, biological and chemical weapons, because it's for defensive purposes. And that's how they but again, it's always went through the military industrial complex. Everything that's going on is still very much through DoD auspices. I mean, warp speed and all that, it's still under DoD. And it's like, there's so much interesting stuff here when people realize, like, it is all married. You can't look at it like the military industrial complex doesn't include the medical industrial complex. And I think Bobby Kennedy's new book of this winter, if it comes out this winter, when it comes out, it's going to be eye-opening for people on exactly these things.
I hope it's able to get out, because he's really been throttled in getting his message out.
Of course,
it was very convenient that this new theater of war happens and his book vanishes, and it's sort of like you're playing, like magic, where it's like, it's here, it's there. And I agree with you. I think it is controlled. I feel somewhat privileged because I grew up amongst Holocaust survivors. And I asked questions because I felt it was my story, and they didn't tell their kids because it was too close to the generation. So the problem that I had, because I had a fascination with it, it was sort of like I had to be vigilant, because when was it going to happen again? Because it always seems to happen, and it always there might be different characters, but it's like, I got to share with you, lately in Hollywood, all the movies are terrible remakes. Like, it's basically they use the same thing, and it's like a graphic novel for me, because I really don't know. Like, when I starve, like maybe I fasted for a day. I don't know what starving is. However, there's people who's actually seen evil. I'll share with you a quick story. I have a friend of mine. She was leading the protests in Toronto back in 2020, and she's a single mother. And she decided to leave because she was scared that they would they would go after her child. And I did an interview with her recently, and she's down in Mexico. And she was sharing what it was like growing up in Romania when Ceausescu fell. So she knew the signs, and she was yelling and screaming. She got more charity than I do, but she prays for. She's praying for these people that they will wake up, because this is a road that's been taken before. Like, when you talk about the testing and everything, no one knows about the Gesundheit passes. That was how Hitler was able to go and put people into ghettos, saying that the Jews and these different types of people had typhoid, so typhus. So they were able to start putting them away. It's like, it's all of it. It's, Joseph Campbell said, old wine in new bottles.
Well, when people were making those comparisons, of course, the ADL came after them and were making, saying, oh, this is anti-Semitic, just like when people were comparing Fauci to Mengele, right? Experiment, yeah, as an experimenter basically on people. And of course, Laura Logan was fired for that, or not fired, but basically, called anti-Semitic and sort of, put into a corner.
It's all bullshit, because if anyone listened to what Elie Wiesel was talking about, he basically, through his life, was saying that this is something that we can learn and apply for humanity. It's like, so many people have, like, they say they can't look at certain things, and it's a learning, looking at living people. And it's like, so yeah, it just frustrated me, because of virtue signal. But I will share this with you, Sean. As I thought recently about it, I did a lot of reflection on myself, and I believe most people are materialists. They're caught by what they had, and they're holding on so much to it. They're not willing to question, because the fear of losing their identity, their homes, their businesses, everything. And I believe it's, when they say flight and fight, I'd say 99% is freeze. I just see freezing.
Yeah. It's freezing, because also we're not intuitive, like, we've been taken out of our many of our primal elements, right? And so there's an interesting thing I was reading anthropologically, like there's The Dawn of Everything is this new anthropology book, and there's these talks between the Europeans and some of the natives of the I want to say the 17th or 18th century, and the natives are saying, what we don't want in our society is money in the same way that you do, because money has corrupted you to the place where you're no longer self-sufficient. You're all servile to your kings. You're going to put on your wig. You're going to take hours to put on your dress to fit into your society. You will, if someone higher than you will run into the street and basically, kneel and crap and shit, right? To bow to that which is your superior. And it's like, within our society, like, everyone is like, we're first among equals. Like, a chief is like first among equals, right? We all respect the individual's right to say no to anything. Then you have to convince us if we want us to do something, but we're all self-sufficient. We all have the ability to take care of ourselves, and we provide for everyone that doesn't, because again, our needs are minimal compared to yours. But you've constructed these societies where you're basically, you think you have all these things, but you're all basically servile, because you're all looking to be the high, to be the royal, or the aristocrat, or you wish you could be the king, and you're all jealous of that. It's a really interesting debate, discussions that they had back, and this is 400 years ago or so.
I fully believe that too. I believe it's the attachment to things. I really do. I remember a lot. My family came in the 30s to Canada because they had nothing. and I'll share with you something really a funny story. So my daughter goes to me after being in San Diego for a wedding. She goes and says to me, "Dad, are you descended from peasants?" So she says to me, like she takes away ownership that she's from me. And I thought about it, and I looked at her and I said, "You're really lucky that we are, because you wouldn't have been asking the question, because so many people held on to what they had, and therefore it was too late." And that's really this change. Like, you left LA and you're now Florida, well, now Texas. That's a fundamental choice. Like, almost a survival choice, isn't it? Like, what was the motivation for you to leave this cesspool? Because I got to tell you, I'm on my way to Panama to check it out in the next 2 weeks, because this is a stopping place for me. It's not the end place.
I mean, it's not like, how do you say it? It's like during the Great Depression, there was the Great Migration West, right? The Okies, and a lot of people, like, they just left. They said it's, there was the Dust Bowl at the time, and there were other factors, economics, looking for jobs, and California was a promised land. It was go west, at the time. And, that was, California's a beautiful state, but, you think about how it's run, how it's managed, the fact that it's, you're talking about one of the richest countries in the world, if California was a country.
Yeah.
And, that much homelessness, that much crime, that much toxicity. Can't even, they're getting water. I don't even know where they're getting water from other states. They have no strategy for long-term for water. It's like burning every year. They got fires almost every year now. I mean, that wasn't normal when I was a kid, to have these level of fires annually. And not just like fires, like in a logical sense, where it's like you do controlled burns, right? That's a very practical tactic. I don't know if they're doing that on, enough. So they end up with these massive fires, like the one that almost took out Malibu a few years ago, and actually was spewing radioactivity. And it's like, no one even talks about that. Like, whether it's the radiation from Fukushima or the radioactivity that was spewed from the fires, it's like people don't talk about that. Remember when the fire in Malibu a few years ago, it was started like right next to a former nuclear facility. And when I was driving that day, like to work I was like looking up, and there was basically what looked like a mushroom cloud north of the city.
When was that? What year was that?
That was like I want to say late 2018 or 2019.
Okay, I remember seeing that, and you know what I found really creepy? I was visiting LA, and what was creepy is everyone was acting as if it was normal. They're just walking around while this stuff is happening.
Yeah.
You could see it from the city, and it's like, I'm going like, and to me that's like foreshadowing for now, right? Like, they're just acting like it's normal.
Yeah, that's the point. There's something like energetically just off, and it's like then the 5G rolled out, and the 5G, like, which it's like Newsom started with when he was campaigning. I think it was like mayor or one of those posts in San Francisco. Like, he was out there posting how the cell towers were basically toxic. Like there's they're carcinogenic. You say like you don't want to live next to like power lines and cell towers and all this stuff. And now it's just like people have forgotten all that, and they're putting the cell towers everywhere, which is what the 5G is. It's that it's a smaller and you say it's like a smaller wavelength, and so they have to put like small cell towers like on every block, and it's just magnifying the amount of EMF, and people are just not even like, they're just not aware. And so it's unfortunate, but for us, the breaking point was the mandates. When they started saying you have to have vaccine mandates to end, or you have to have jab mandates to enter any restaurant, or you name it. It was like, what the? Obviously now, I mean, we knew right away this was ridiculous, because it wasn't preventing transmission, it wasn't preventing sickness. We knew that, but the point was that your own friends, how can you trust these people? Like, like, not, and I hate to say it, but like Nazi Germany, it's like, I understand why the Jews, a lot of them for the rest of their lives, never trusted the Germans again, because it was like, as a whole, collectively, you allowed this to happen, even if most Germans did not commit crimes during the Holocaust, even if most Germans did not kill Jews. It was like, you allowed this to occur. Psychologically, your own people turned against you and were so scared of the government that they submitted to that. I understand like that psychology of Jews being like, that resent, as like many Jews that resent anything German thereafter, be it, you know, Mercedes or
Yeah.
Volkswagen or BMW, and just like, you know,
Or
in
Ford,
Germany,
or they wouldn't buy Ford either.
well, Ford, of course, we know was
And
working as was
IBM, most of them didn't know about IBM, but they would have.
IBM, Standard Oil was Standard Oil was working with the Nazis. I mean, yeah, absolutely. But I'm saying that I understand that, like, you turned on us. If my family like turns on me, like, that's really scary. I can understand that resentment.
Well, I'm going to share something. They are behaving that against the people who've chosen not to participate in the juice. And they can't see the similarities. And I think it's a human nature thing. I think that there's, I don't know, willing blindness. Also, everybody wants to think they're righteous. Like if you go and see pictures and photographs of guards at like Auschwitz, they were having parties and they were with their children, and they rationalized it. Human beings rationalize things. And the question I have that I wanted to ask you, Sean, what was, during this event, what was your wake-up call? What was your wake-up moment? This was something major.
See, we were watching the 5G rollout because, as I said, California was like center stage for the 5G rollout. And I was talking to people like Daphne Talkover, who works with Children's Health Defense with Bobby Kennedy Jr. And so we were having conversations and like, wow, she's Israeli, right? And she's like, she used to be a communications officer in Israel. And she was like, you know, this is extremely dangerous. And she's electrosensitive. And so some people are electrosensitive, like my partner is electrosensitive, like she's more sensitive to EMF. So she feels it physically. And a lot of us are just not as sensitive. So we don't realize we're being fried, you know, and that's the thing. Like when you're with someone who's sensitive, they can actually feel the 5G is like making them, you know, you name it, making them shake, giving them headaches, like making it difficult to sleep. And so you use people like that, essentially like canaries in the coal mine. You'll be like, okay, there's something off. So we were watching 5G roll through Los Angeles and across California. So we're like, where are we going to go? You know, Santa Barbara and Montecito was like the only area at the time that hadn't allowed 5G. So we basically were already heading in that direction to like get away from LA. When 5G obviously was rolling, they rolled it out through the lockdowns, and that was already assigned to us. Like, okay, they're using this event to, as Bobby Kennedy Jr.
essential workers around the world
to create this the smart meter, the smart cities. Remember, I mean, I've known about this for some time, that there was this whole notion of like the smart city, you know, everything being digitized and connected, you know, again through Wi-Fi and wireless communications and frequency. And again, it's like Wi-Fi is not necessarily like bad. It's just there is a toxicity that you have to be aware of, and levels. And when you're, you know, like I talked about with the cell towers and like cell phones, like we used to know, like, don't put the cell phone to your head. Like now no one talks about that anymore. It's almost like it's been forgotten from our common sense, right? And our instinctive, like, we don't want to necessarily be like interacting constantly with these electronics. They are interfacing with our cells and our bodies. They are, you know, again, they could be, not just could be, like they are considered carcinogenic EMFs. And so it's a question of exposure, and especially for kids and stuff, which no one talks about. So besides Children's Health Defense and others, but the point being that we were watching this, you know, this rollout, and so I immediately knew the agenda because I know how these things work. I mean, it was like, you know, the first few days I was a little nervous, I guess, when they said like, you know, the SARS-2 is here. I knew about SARS-1 because I was supposed to go to China back in 2000. I want to say 4 when it first rolled out, 3 or 4. And, you know, we couldn't go there.
2003.
Yeah, SARS-1, exactly, because of SARS-1. So I was aware of SARS, but, you know, I was like, okay, like, you know, it's a respiratory thing. Obviously, like, you know, I had to like go into it, but I immediately checked into myself and realized like, this is mostly fear. There's like, you know, it's like most illness. It's like, it's an immune response. And so can we get into, first of all, I don't want to be in 5G because it's weakening my immune system. So I'm going to get away from that. So we got away from that, went to the countryside, and also just checked into like the fear factor of like, am I afraid? And it's like, no, I overcame the fear in myself of being ill. So I immediately understood like, okay, this is a fear thing. So once they stretched out the lockdowns and we're looking at the data, and it's like, so most people who are dying are over 70. They have 2 to 3 comorbidities. This is not very deadly. And you're talking to people and they're like, the kids aren't getting sick, young people aren't getting sick. And you're sitting there going, so what is your logic? and then they, it's like, that's when, like, okay, this is a complete operation, because no one is being like coherent. I mean, then you see like people like McCullough and the frontline doctors who are like trying to treat patients, and then, they're being attacked and sabotaged, and, told they can't use, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and things like this. And that's like, yeah, this is an operation. So really, by like month, I would say by 4 to 6 weeks in, it was clear what was being done was a total social experiment, psychological operation. Obviously, it was going to affect the election, as we found out with the whole mail-in voting nonsense, where it's like you can go stand in line to go to the grocery store, but you can't go you can't go and vote in person. It's just like, it was just so clear what was going on, right?
It's, for me, it's like the Bitterman coercion chart, and they're like literally doing this on society. And for those who don't know what the Bitterman coercion chart was, it was Dr. Bitterman studied POW, American POWs that were released from Korea. They were mind controlled in the fact that they turned against America, and they didn't really torture them. They led them through a process, and you can see that it's almost step by step. And they even tell us. That's a part that's pretty scary, because I'm Canadian. We don't have an army. However, it came out that the army was using psychological tools on the Canadian people. So it's really strange. Like, I've really crossed the Rubicon, and I realized that there's a devil, or an energy, a negative energy, and there's a basic rule. They have to tell us what they're going to do to us. If we choose not to do anything, then we've given our consent. I'll give you an example. My daughters were born in Toronto, and they were American because of their mother being an American. If they never lived in America, they would be subject to all the rules in America. So at age 18, they would have to make the decision within 6 months to denounce their US citizenship, or they would have the privilege of paying American taxes or state taxes for the rest of their life. However, if they never were told it, well, the information's out there. The IRS doesn't give a shit.
Yeah,
In essence,
exactly.
they would give their consent. Similar to when my parents got me a bank account when I was a kid at 18. I had like 6 months before I become subject to the rules. And that's really hard to stomach, to realize that they tell us. And some of the things that they choreograph, maybe you can address this for me. Like, I started like asking some serious questions. Like, I watched the 1992 Barcelona opening games, and they're choreographing SARS, and then they did it in 2012 in the like the London, and then the Goddard cave opening. Like, I'm just sitting watching this stuff, and I'm thinking, like, this is like creepy. And if you look at it all separately, then it, basically you're the frog in a pot that's just slowly going up. But if you start putting these things together, it's like a jigsaw puzzle that's
Well,
coming
to me,
together.
that's occultism. I mean, those are the kind of things that I consider occult, and
Yes.
occult being like, you can do magical practices at how do you say, with intention, right, and ritual,
Yep.
right, and that's why it's so difficult to say, like, well, when films like Back to the Future and Matrix like reference 9/11, 2001, like, are they really, is it because the director or the set designer really knows about what's happening on 9/11, or is it more, we're all tapping in as creators, right? Especially when you're an
Yep.
artist, like, you're constantly working with the imaginal realms. That's the thing. Like, it's, what do you think, how do you think you tell, as like, how do you write a book? Or it's like, you can either write it based on just pure facts and nonfiction, or, you're tuning in, like, you're getting inspiration, you're getting ideas, you're tuning into something that is
Like
greater
Carl
than
Jung,
yourself.
like, so you're like
Well,
saying
Jung talks
Carl
about
Jung
like
and the
like your own concept.
universal
Well, like,
consciousness, and
yeah,
Shendrick
like
with like
and it wasn't really like, it wasn't necessarily like he invented it. I mean, Oversoul like was a lot of the what was it, Thoreau, Emerson, what they call the transcendentalists, I think, of the US, like,
yeah.
they were tuning in. That was from the Eastern tradition, like India, talking about oversouls, and like, so again, this idea that we're all connected, right? So if we're all, again, we are all connected. we start to understand that more and more as we tune into this energy that does connect us, right? That's beyond the physical body, the separation, the materialist perspective. So in many ways, the occultists that are working to plant seeds in consciousness, to do rituals, to basically get us to participate and to choose things, right, through a lot of magic, word magic, imagery. That's what media is. Media is, it's a use of imagery, right? I understood this as a kid. It's like once you frame a box, you have no idea what's outside of there. Once you make a cut, basically you're telling the audience, like, this is all that's important. Once you choose your language, as we're talking about earlier with the presidents being actors, like the choosing of the language, what words to use, right? How to draw emotion from people, how to draw, how do you say, to draw their trust. All of these things that are going into it, like, this is huge. Like, it's just like huge ritual, right? The whole notion of how these countries, born of empires, have been formed, right? The fact that, like, America, in a sense, was in its founding trying to break from the rituals and the control of the British Empire. I don't know if they fully really succeeded, actually, because there's more, like, it does seem that that we are still a part of the British Empire in some ways, not as strongly as Canada or Australia or the other.
We crossed the Rubicon.
That's
Well,
what I want
okay,
to hear.
I'll tell you what the Rubicon is. I started asking the things that I was scared to ask.
Yeah.
So it's like a flat earth. Like who would, like, a nutcase would ask that, or is it real evil? However, then I started asking myself a question. I said, well, if I was the devil, what would I do? And I said, well, you look at history. I'll give you a perfect example of history. You look at the Bible. When the first temple was destroyed, what did the Assyrian king do? He moved people around to different places where they didn't have an invested interest. And you start looking at what's happening in the world with the immigration. Like, they're bringing people who do not have an invested interest in the culture of the people. And you can start seeing that, like, there's people who might be conscious. I might not be conscious. I might not believe in revelations, but someone definitely does. And so I start asking these questions. I start going and taking a Nikon 9000 camera, and I start seeing much further than I'm supposed to see. I start asking questions. I start asking why. I said, why do we have NASA? And then I start looking at, why is there you understand what I'm saying? Because I never really noticed it before, because I didn't need to notice it, because my life was goddamn good. I was living an incredible materialist life. I had a good income. I was respected. And there was no reason for me to even ask the question.
Right.
But it was sort of like the Matrix, where the cat glitches and I have to pay attention. Like, I was stuck in Toronto for the first 5 months, and I was downtown, and I was walking past the hospital every day, because I think it was like A.J. I have to be careful, was saying that they were showing pictures of that they were empty, and I was doing it, like, I was watching it, they were all empty. I'm going, like, this is crazy.
Right.
So there was a glitch, and then the question I had was, am I brave enough mentally to go and do things that I know they're going to potentially alienate me from the community I thought I had? And am I prepared for that?
Caught up with that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was curious about, you said before we were talking about Elon Musk that you weren't a fan of his. And so I was just curious what you think about this whole Twitter takeover and what he's really about.
Everything he does is anti-human, but he actually says good things. And I realized, here you are, you're a perfect example. You grew up in the fakeness of Hollywood, meaning, like, it was all PR, and it's all making. And I'm thinking, well, they tell us. So if I do my digging about Elon Musk and his family, his father wasn't a very good man. He ended up, like, having a child with his, I guess, his stepdaughter or something like that. Like, he was super, super rich. Not exactly like the humble beginnings that Elon likes to propose. He also rewrote the history of many things that he got involved in. It was very important for him to say he was the founder of PayPal, and he was like, all these things. And I'm thinking, he could have been created. Like I think Burnham von Braun, actually, getting back to the thing, he had a book on going to Mars, and the lead character was Elon. Just like there was a bunch of books in 1898 called Baron Trump, right? And he happened to live at Trump Tower. Like these are things that I'm thinking that maybe I'm an amoeba, you and I are an amoeba, and there's an intelligence, which you can call whatever you want, that, is like game this so much. So getting back to Elon Musk, what you were saying, I look at, he's saying all the right things. He's going to implant things in people's heads. He wants the lithium batteries are worse than oil and gas. It's just the worst thing out there. It's like the average person mining dies at 35. We're talking, he says all the right things. So now if he's going to talk about free speech, oh my God. So the world is a globe, and it's okay to to implant his stuff in you and put things like 5G and everything up in the air. It's like, this is a PR scam. That's the way I look at it. Like, I remember researching Bill Gates, and there's the PR story, and then there's the real story when you start looking into what happened and where, like why the hell, when they opened Microsoft, why did they go to Albuquerque? Well, guess what's in Albuquerque? A big department of your government, which we're not supposed to know the research they do. You start asking questions.
New Mexico, that reminds me of the Clintons. Was it Clinton's energy guy was the governor there? He was close to Epstein as well. What's the name of that guy? That's New Mexico for you.
Okay, I can't remember. I'm a little older than you, so I had a senior moment. but that's what I mean by, like, when I start digging, I start asking questions. But I'll share with you a really interesting conversation I had, and the reason I wanted to interview him. Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace. The reason I sat down with Patrick is Patrick started speaking heresy for the environmental movement, because this is very important. The reason I wanted to speak to Patrick had nothing to do with what he did. I'm more interested in what people think and how they think and how they survive. Because basically, I'm asking that question for me because I think we're getting ready for something, and hopefully we can buy time. I can learn from someone without directly experiencing it. So Patrick Moore was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, and I wanted to speak to him and understand how he survived. Everyone who was part of his world, especially about Greenpeace, they all turned on him, called him a Benedict Arnold. They looked at him as being evil, and he'd been possessed. And all he had done is he spoke the truth, because he was the only person in Greenpeace at the beginning who had a PhD in the environmental studies and science, and he was the only one who wasn't an urban dweller. He actually grew up, his family were loggers, and for the first 8 years of his life, he lived on logs, like literally there was no shoreline. So I wanted to find out from Patrick, how did you survive this? Because so many people, their worlds have been blown apart. People don't talk to them. They're not invited to weddings. They're not invited to birthday parties. They're not, like, this is just what's happened. Everyone who hasn't crossed the Rubicon is considered, they consider them crazy. Like, how did you survive? And how do you know that you're talking to an authentic person? So he said to me that the people who he came to the party with were still there, like his wife and his immediate family, because they knew who he was. And I said, well, how do you know when someone, like I approached you, Sean, how do you know? And this is a key, and it ties back to what you were talking about, how we're disconnected. This is how he knows. He just knows. He trusts what he feels, whether the person is full of shit, has an agenda, and is trying to, make him bad. He's learned to trust his intuition. And that is the greatest gift that he gave to me, because he gave me confirmation for me of what I already knew. And we all know that. And
Yes.
to trust our intuition. because it knows. And there was a book that was called Power versus Force. Have you heard of it, by David Hawkins?
No, that
And
is the title.
it is a very powerful book, and basically says we have access to so much information that our minds can't process, but if we can actually bring the question to a yes or no, we'll know. We'll know the answer because we have access to so much that you're right. We've outsourced it through phones and through computers and through like Wikipedia, things that make us human.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the Patrick Morris story, because that's the question I asked. Because I think in this world that's going to happen, we're going to have to ask those yes and right questions. And I'll leave this with you, Sean. I shared with you at the beginning, I grew up with Holocaust survivors, and I used to ask them questions. I was curious, and I was of the age where they were willing to share. They didn't share to their children's generation, but at the end they were sharing. And there were people who would tell me that their logic told them they should go left. Their logic, but they went right. And by going and falling here, they lived. While
You're left.
everyone else who was following their logic, they're gone.
Yeah.
And that is how you will survive and thrive.
I want to give you one thing on Elon that I was just
Yeah,
thinking
please.
about. It's so I totally agree with you. You know, like at one point we were talking about he was going to put 5G satellites up in space and basically blast us all with 5G. So there's definitely like murky things. You have to even wonder, like, how did he become this rich, right? Between, like, the PayPal, the Tesla, like, who's backing it, right? Who's behind it? Obviously major deals,
Yeah.
major players like this are also oftentimes like front people for other factors.
Fractional banking, all they
Right.
have to do is like say that we're going to make you the biggest thing in the world, Sean, and immediately they have a PR department, and there you are. You are better than sliced bread.
Well, and it's not just, that's just these are, how do you say, these are oftentimes government contracts that
Yes.
that are giving, that are helping to facilitate these kind of billionaires, to become this rich. So when I'm thinking of, what he's doing, and as you mentioned, like the mining and how, how like just this, the whole the whole push to like electric vehicles and whatnot, it's like a lot of nonsense. And you actually talking about EMF sensitivity, you sit in a Tesla and it's like you get fried and you feel like you're inside of a battery, you're just getting cooked. It's not really healthy. But here's what's interesting. He did push against the sort of like the more satanic cabal during the lockdowns. Like he was like saying, like, we're not going to basically be locked out of work. We're not going to force, a lot of these things
Controlled opposition.
Maybe. And
what was it called? What was it called? Operation Trust during the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, no, I get it.
Goldstein in 1984.
No, I totally hear what you're saying. And towards the Twitter buyout, he's definitely data mining, because that's what you would want to do if you're basically working to, like, to create AI and to sort of, build out, anything in terms of the artificial intelligence realm. You want to data mine humans. You also want to, get to know, I say, human behavior, language, and all this stuff. Absolutely, that's an aspect of it. But can you also consider that he has become aware of the danger of AI, perhaps along the way? And so maybe it's not just as simple as he's looking to basically, to replace humanity. He actually said something that most elites will never say. There's not enough humans. Most elites are all about depopulation. Elon said the opposite. So I always think, like, yes, there are flags and there are things you have to look at. But like with Trump, can you, I didn't like Trump as a person until, he became president. And I was like, there are things that he's doing that you can't just call controlled opposition, that is more, how do you say, pro-human than the other side. And so, as long as at least the more pro-human faction is going, I appreciate that they're fighting, because otherwise we'll be taken over completely.
I fully agree. I appreciate the things they do.
Yeah.
So a clock is right twice a day. And I truly, however, I can't help but start questioning, because I would do this. I would do, like, to have my own opposition. Like, we don't elect politicians, they're selected. And it's like, I know that, I've seen that happen. I saw that in my own country. I had a good friend of mine who ran against Justin Trudeau for the leadership, and I'm not a liberal. I'm more, I guess I was more conservative, but he was a friend of mine. I had to give my donations to him. So on my tax return, I looked like I was a liberal. Well, of course, he lost, and Justin took away his writing and put in someone from the UN NATO. Just broke all democracy. Put this person in, and you start seeing this. But when you step back, you start seeing. Well, you asked about Canada earlier, so I'm going to give you an example. Which, if I look at things isolated, I would, say, oh, like I'm the frog and they're turning up the water. But I start looking at everything together, I get really concerned. So what's happened in my country? What I was saying about if you take everything, you put it together. Well, I was at the hospitals. I was going every single day, seeing the ambulances. Like in Toronto, they're clustered. The hospitals downtown Toronto. I'd walk there because I was stuck there because I almost died in 2019. So as a Canadian, I couldn't renew my insurance here, so I ran back to Canada and left my family here. So I was downtown Toronto walking every day, and I kept on like looking, and I'm thinking like, this is like, where are the dying people? Like where are? And I just in Canada we have an LCBO, which is a liquor control board. It's not like in the States where you can buy it anywhere. Man, people were like, I got one bottle of wine. We're talking, people were like lining up like with like, I don't know, full baskets of like,
Yeah.
it was just crazy. But when you put everything together, look at that, and then you start looking at, okay, in 2017, the Liberal government went after small businesses. I did an interview with the guy who's leading the fight in Canada, just went after them. He like said they were, like making it so like, why would you own a business? And then you have, they're attacking guns right now. And they also, if you go and call in number 5 on Canada Health and you press 5, you can have assisted suicide for being depressed now.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that? The government, well, even worse than that, because the Ontario Medical Association says if you don't want to be vaxxed, then you need psychiatric, you can be considered nuts, right? Think about that. Got the equivalent of FEMA camps. You don't have guts. So you asked that question. So I just wanted to answer that it's control. Sort of like this has all been planned. Like all these people, like if I was the devil, I wouldn't actually exercise this unless I had actually, completely mapped it out and looked at all things that we're going to have, like removed all safety nets so we could actually push this new agenda, knowing that we could, and knowing that people like you and I would exist too. The fact is that this was so gamed. So Sean, with all that's happening right now, what would you suggest for somebody who wants to start investigating and asking the questions that might be a little uncomfortable? Where would be the best place to start?
There's no best place to start. What I find is that people have their own experiences. Everyone has their own experience of reality, right? None of us share. We have shared like events, right, that we can look to and say, well, there's whatever, there's a war, there's COVID, there's maybe working in the same job, watching the same movie, but every one of us experiences it from our lens, from our worldview. We have our belief systems that's operating within us when we're watching something. So it's impossible to for two people to then agree if we're watching the same lockdown event and you're like, man, this is an agenda, and the other person is like, what? No, this is completely rational. This is exactly what you should do, to protect people, right? I mean, it's worldviews that are work here, and you can't force someone's worldview to change. What you can do is allow them to find through their own life experiences those moments that are, I call it like singularity points. So like there's no going back from that, right? It's the moment when you go to the hospital and realize, my God, they're killing my daughter, and this is insane. Like, why are they doing this, right? And this is like an interview I just did recently with a man whose daughter basically was killed because they didn't want to put her on a ventilator, I guess, when she had COVID in the hospital. And so it's like, that moment of experience, there's something wrong, there's something very wrong with what's going on, and it's not the way that you're shown in the media of how doctors are supposed to behave, right? And again, it's not saying everyone is that way, but we all have our moments of realizing, there's something wrong here. And if you can actually follow that to then do your own research, to then start to look at things from your own perspective with your own intuition, because we talked about earlier, we have been so stripped from our innate like understanding of reality. We're put in a matrix where, we're basically operating, separated from land, separated from natural laws, put into these artificial cities that have artificial laws, and how do you say, and even relationship to to self is very much through the filter of how I'm supposed to behave, how am I supposed to look, how am I supposed to, to act, all these things that are basically, the pervasiveness of media, right? That even when I was born and when you were born, it wasn't as much as it is now, because we didn't grow up with cell phones in our hands. We grew up, still there was a television and you had so many channels, but you probably weren't sitting in front of the TV all day. You were probably out there in the world, like playing and doing things, right? And having your own. And now it's like the pervasiveness of media. It's like a lot of kids are just literally just blanketed by social media, TikTok, YouTube, news, you name it, like all these different channels, 24-hour news cycles. Like that wasn't no 24-hour news cycle when we were kids. It was like, the clock news or something, right? And not to say it was better, but just to say the blanketing of the consciousness, such that we just don't really know who or what we are unless we get back into that quiet space of, doing the meditation or the prayer, the coming into oneself, sitting in nature or going for a walk in nature, being with yourself, being still and quiet. If you can't do that, there's no way to think for yourself.
Well, one last question. How important is finding your community? Because it's one thing to have this awakening question. For me, when I had my epiphanies in my 20s, I started reading because the people around me didn't have the same perspective that I did. And so I would read Emerson, and I would read Buckminster Fuller, and I would read, you name it, I would read, and I would have those little voices. And that led me to seek out people for a community. How important when someone's starting to question that they find a community? Because I don't know about your situation, but I know in my situation, there's been a huge break where I'm not invited to certain places anymore in my own family, because I've said things that they felt threatening to their map of the world. How important is finding your community, especially during this time in this place?
Yeah, well, I feel like it's easier. It's growing easier and easier over time. Um, because we're in a place where in the last few years, it's been easier to see people who are standing for personal sovereignty, right? Health sovereignty, health freedom, on those fronts. And then, people that are pro individual freedom, to me, are already part of my community, right? I already want to spend more time with them. And yeah, so that's where we're drawn as a result. And you see it, people are moving to, places like, Tennessee and Texas and Florida. And okay, so that's already a good sign that those might be places to check out. Costa Rica has obviously come up a lot. Mexico's come up. Yeah, so again, I just think that it's easier to find people than ever because of social media, because of just the nature of these conversations. And, there are people all around too. I mean, you don't have to leave your state. I'm sure that, and even within a lot of cities and townships, you'll find a lot of people that are like-minded, even if it's only a handful. How many friends do you need in life, right?
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, a handful of good friends is a blessing. And then, others obviously that are, willing to gather and listen and commune. And, that's beautiful itself. You don't all have to agree. We don't have to agree. It's not like we need to be like, the Borg and say like, you can only spend time with me if you agree with me.
Right.
But there's an energy to it. There's an energy of open-mindedness. There's an energy to open-minded people that are willing to listen and exchange ideas. And, even if we disagree, it's like, enjoy a good debate as opposed to feeling like offended or, angry. It's like, you disagree with me and you're gonna like get angry because there's certain energies of people that get hostile as opposed to like, huh, okay, that's interesting. Tell me your perspective. Huh, okay, I'm learning now. As opposed to a lot of people, because of Twitter, I think, I don't know, like people just regurgitate stuff. And it's like Twitter has kind of helped facilitate that idea of just taking complex situations and boiling it into like, whatever, 60 characters or less. And so
Yeah.
they speak that way. You talk about, this lawsuit against Alex Jones, it becomes a soundbite. Like, no, it's because of, and it's like, you just repeated exactly what the mainstream media is saying. This election, if you vote Republican, it's going to destroy the democracy. It's like, where did you get that from?
Right.
You must have heard that in the mainstream media.
I fully agree. Most people, one of the last question I want to ask you, and first I just want to preface it. Most people I found, you ask them a question and they begin with a conclusion. So basically, and they basically start being rope. And if you question them, I think it was Mark Twain says it's easier to lie to someone than to show them they've been lied to. So one question I have is, now that you have that inquisitive mind, you've always had that inquisitive mind, but you see more now, would you ever want to go back? And I will say that I would not, even though it'd be a lot more comfortable to be Cypher in the Matrix, being put back. I would never want to go back to not questioning, not seeing, not putting things together. It's sort of at the same time, you're right. The people who are waking up to the fact that things aren't the way we were told they were, they're curious, they're excited. Those conversations, they're learning. It's like tutorials. I mean, just coming together. Share with me, would you change what you've learned in your experience to go back to the way it was? Or the way you were?
You don't remember what I told you at the beginning. I was never in the Matrix mentally. So I don't know what that would be like. I really don't know. That's just not the way I've ever been. I've ever been designed to like, literally from elementary school, I was taught to like, read these books, read the history that they're not teaching you. Starting with history, right? Like think outside of, read for yourself. Don't just read what the textbook tells you. And so as a result, I've just never, and also because I'm a more imaginative person, so I ask questions. I'm very philosophical. I'm always like thinking and, basically analyzing and trying out different ideas and, just exploring in the mental fields. It's impossible for me to be like in a matrix modality of, I don't even know what that means. I don't. It's not in my.
You were very blessed on the fact that I look at it just how would I phrase this? I didn't realize how much an impact my father had on me until he was no longer here. He died when I was 29 years old and he was 59. The fact is that your parents gave you a framework where you could question. That was part of the lexicon. That was what opened up different neural pathways. And I believe that's the greatest gift that your parents gave you, the fact that you could explore and you weren't defined by who you were, where you came from, all that. And that is what an open mind is. And that's what I'm hoping from these videos, that people realize that they're not whatever they think they are. They are a spiritual being having a human experience. And they can make a difference in their lives. And through that, maybe they'll open up other people's eyes. And I want to thank you so much, Sean, for spending this time with me. This is great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. You've been awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And the greatest healer for anybody later on in life is to mentor younger people. And I find this all the time. I sit down with business owners all the time, and they always give me unsolicited advice because they want to share their knowledge, and it's really important.
Here with me is Peter Merrick,
president of MerrickWealth.com.
Peter is an income and capital enhancement consultant,
speaker, and author.
He is also a
recognized expert in the world of succession planning.
Over 800 published articles and 3 industry textbooks.
He's a Canadian who joins us today from San Diego, California. Thanks for joining us.
So, Peter Merrick, tell us about you.
Well, I've been in the financial service industry since the end of 1991. I graduated during the recession. The baby boomers were in their positions, so there was no jobs. So the two businesses that opened up were the technology field and the financial field. It was the Wild West in both of them. So I had this brilliant idea, and I had a friend of mine, and we started talking, and I said, hey, how difficult would it be for us to get a mutual fund dealer license? Not difficult enough. Thank God for those 10 years, the market just went up. I would sit down and I would take somebody's entire life savings that they spent 15, 20 years accumulating it, this young kid who knew nothing about nothing, and I would go and just invest it, and luckily it went up because the markets were crazy in the 90s. It was a boom time. But in 2004, my life blew up. I almost went bankrupt, but I was very fortunate because there were very few CFPs at the time, but every university in Canada wanted to offer the CFP program, so I got recruited as a prof. And it was great. I was reading all the textbooks. I would call all the big publishers. And what I came to the conclusion was the succession planning was missing. One of the issues is there was very little talking beyond the accumulation stage. Like, how do you have a healthy life after you've done that? I also looked at demographics. At the turn of the 20th century, the average life expectancy in the West and North America was 43 years old. And people are dying at 83. No one ever lived to 83.
Well, so I always say that there's 2 financial plans. There's the financial one that we work on, and there's what you're going to do with all your time and that energy once you're done. And with this thing that they've been racing towards, they've hit it. But if they haven't thought about what they're going to do after or how they're going to feel validation for their existence, they just never stop. They just keep going.
Well, it's not anybody's fault because when people are young, they focus too much on doing. And later on in life, they have to focus on being. So I wrote my own textbooks because I thought it was very important to talk about how do you transition from the first half of life, which Carl Jung called it the mourning, where you're accumulating, whether it's your ego, designations, education, houses. The second half is deconstruction, giving wisdom away, giving away my money, giving away my time, leaving a legacy.
So talk to me about that stage. What's the purposeful way or kind of the best practices, ways, or considerations for people to take when transitioning into that stage of life?
Well, one, decide whether or not you want an exit. I find between the ages of 55 and 70, a lot of people feel that I'm just tired doing the same thing that I've always done. And I have the money now. So maybe I should get out when the going is good and pass on my business to someone who's got the energy to navigate it. Number 2, who are you going to sell your business to? There's one issue about selling it to a family member or an employee. What happens after you sell it? Things don't go right. A lot of business owners want to sell their business because they just want to wash their hands. But by selling it to someone you know, you're not getting out of your business. The best is to sell to a third-party purchaser. The last one is after they make that transition from being a business owner, building a nest egg for themselves to have choice, they don't know what they're going to do. I've spoken to people who say, I'm going to take up golf. So my question is, do you golf now? I don't golf now. So what makes you think you're going to golf later? I just want to share with you guys a story. There was a gentleman, his name was Bob Hunter. He was quite a celebrity. He started Greenpeace during the height of my blow up. When I was going through business loss, he was bringing me on national television. And you know what he was doing? He was saying, so Peter, don't you do that? And then he would give my phone number and he would give my web address. The reason why it went by merrickwealth.com, because it was almost like a phone number that would run across the television, and I could actually see myself making money off of it. And he was dying. He had prostate cancer. And he turned to me and said, Peter, one day you will be in a position that you'll help someone else. And let me share with you about the legacy. Bob's been dead for 16 years. And I'm sharing you the legacy of Bob Hunter because he made a difference for me. And if I make a difference in anyone else's life, I'm a product of those people who are willing to do things and they had no expectations. And a true mentor is someone who has no expectations that they're going to see the tree blossom.
The reason I wrote The King of Main Street is younger people don't know how to find the right mentors, and older people have this need to mentor. It's almost like a biological need because they can see beyond their physical existence. They know that the sun was here before them and it will be after them, and what's going to be left behind that they leave.
I would joke, I can't make you money, but I can definitely save you money. What I mean by that is I am a Sherpa. That's someone who would guide someone to help them come down. But I realize the most precious asset they have is not their money. It's their time.
What last piece of advice would you like to give our listeners?
If you have a business, the most important thing to ask yourself is, why did you get into the business? And it's usually not to create a legacy, it's to create the lifestyle that you want. And at that point, ask yourself, what do you want to do during your last days? The last human freedom is to choose one's own beliefs, one's own way. Everything else you can have taken away from you. But what you believe and how you choose to act in the world, that is yours. And the greatest healer for anybody later on in life is to mentor younger people. And that is going to give you fulfillment emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. You guys have been wonderful, and I want to thank you, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.